Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. Probably no event in the Old Testament is as well documented as Sennacherib's invasion of Judah in 701 BC. The Bible itself gives us three accounts: 2 Kings 18 and 19, Isaiah 36-37, and 2 Chronicles 32. In addition, we have several versions of Sennacherib's own report on the event. One of them you see here, the so-called Taylor Prism or Prism of Sennacherib. It contains a report in Sennacherib's own voice of 8 campaigns, and the third of which is the one we're talking about here. It even mentions Hezekiah, and later in this talk I'll quote from it. And then there are the famous Siege of Lachish reliefs carved out in stone. Lachish was an important city in Judah. There have been found these reliefs in Nineveh. They were part of the palace of Sennacherib, and they show in gruesome detail how his army went about besieging and storming the city of Lachish and what it did to its population afterwards. It contains some graphic and horrible detail of the Assyrians impaling people, flaying them alive, that sort of thing. This illustration shows only a small part of those reliefs. It's a very dynamic scene in which the Assyrians are storming the city walls. On the right side, you can see Assyrian archers moving up using an artificial ramp that the Assyrians have constructed. In this way, storming the city wall. In the center, there's a tower with defenders of the city on top. Now, all sorts of objects are coming down, stones, torches, and other things thrown at the Assyrians to try and stop them. And then in the lower left, if you look carefully, you can see a siege engine, a battering ram that the Assyrians used to break through city walls. And then in the lower center, at the bottom of the tower, there are some people coming out, carrying their belongings with them. Now, presumably these are inhabitants of the city that are being deported, that are led away into captivity. Now, there's much more to see on these reliefs. If you have some time, it would be worth going to the ancient history site with the Ancient History Encyclopedia. It has a great article on the Siege of Lachish reliefs with great pictures that show a lot of detail with explanation. At the end of this video, when the credits and the references come, there will be the information and the website where you can go to look at these pictures. Very worthwhile. Now, this relative wealth of material does not make it easier to determine what exactly really happened. There are contradictions and tensions between the biblical and Assyrian versions, and even within the biblical accounts, it's difficult to see how some of the pieces fit together. I've been working on a study guide for the book of Isaiah, which I hope to make available later this year, and ran into a recent dissertation. A dissertation by Nazir Khalid Mahdi dealing with Sennacherib's campaign in Judah. And with this help, I decided to take a fresh look at the accounts in Kings and Isaiah. I will start with some background information on Sennacherib, including his own statement on the invasion and his dealings with Hezekiah. This will show us two main points of conflict between Sennacherib's version and the Bible. After proposing a solution, I will turn to the account in 2 Kings and to the question why Sennacherib left and returned to Nineveh. The answer is not as obvious as it may appear. It has been another point of contention among interpreters. This map shows the Assyrian Empire at its greatest extension, which was not yet the case under Sennacherib. Egypt was not yet part of the empire. Here we have Nineveh, which was the capital of the empire under Sennacherib. Here's Babylon. Here's Sidon and Tyre. We'll talk about them in a moment. Eltica and the Philistine areas right here, and of course Judah. Now, during its history, the Assyrian Empire had incorporated many smaller city-states and kingdoms, and these were expected to make substantial yearly tribute payments. This burden was substantial and made it attractive to try and break free from the empire, even though the Assyrians were ruthless and brutal in their suppression of revolts. Still, revolts were frequent, especially when a new king ascended to the throne, which is what happened in 705 when Sennacherib succeeded his father, Sargon. Before he became king, Sennacherib had administrated the empire, while his father took care of military campaigns. Sennacherib had not been involved in any campaign himself, so no one expected much of him as a military leader. Now, this turned out to be a serious mistake. Sennacherib proved to be a capable leader of the army. His first campaign, in 703, took him to Babylon, where Merodach-Baladan had seized power. The latter makes a brief appearance in 2 Kings 20 and Isaiah 39. 2 years later, 701, Sennacherib turned his attention to the rebellious nations in the west of his empire. With the encouragement of Egypt, Assyria's main rival at the time, the city-states of Tyre and Sidon, the Philistines, Judah, and some other small nations had rebelled against Assyrian rule. Now, Sennacherib first dealt with Tyre and Sidon. He defeated the Egyptians and the Philistines further south, and then invaded Judah. Now, we should not misread or underestimate the biblical accounts of this attack. It was a devastating affair. Yes, Jerusalem was gloriously saved, but much of the rest of Judah was ravaged and destroyed. Here's how Isaiah described the invasion. Your country lies desolate. Your cities are burnt with fire. In your very presence, foreigners devour your land. It is desolate, as overthrown by foreigners. If the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we should have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. And this describes the campaign in Sennacherib's own words, taken from that prism that I showed you earlier. 46 of his strong walled cities I besieged and took them. 200,150 people I brought away from them and counted as spoil. Hezekiah himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver he had brought after me to Nineveh, my royal city. To pay tribute and to accept servitude, he dispatched his messengers. Now, if you've never read this text before, you may be especially surprised about two things. Sennacherib's report does not admit defeat, but claims success, and it asserts that Hezekiah sent him a substantial tribute to Nineveh. The biblical account, at least in 2 Kings 18, does indeed speak of a tribute, but seems to place it at the beginning of the invasion, before Sennacherib's departure, and in Lachish, not Nineveh. This leads to two main questions, therefore. First, was Sennacherib defeated or not? And second, when and where did Sennacherib receive a tribute from Hezekiah? Even without further background information, the first question is not so hard to answer. Sennacherib's account is propaganda. He puts as positive a spin on the events as he can. His silence speaks louder than his words. Why does Sennacherib not tell us that he took Jerusalem and its king? Why did he merely lock him up like a bird in a cage? Matthew's dissertation confirms these doubts about Sennacherib's version. Matthew took a comprehensive look at all the campaigns of Sennacherib as presented in official inscriptions, not just the one against Judah, and this enabled him to establish what was normal or typical for such campaigns, and to determine what was abnormal in Sennacherib's report about Hezekiah in Jerusalem. It was certainly not normal to leave a defeated king in his city and in power. On other occasions, Sennacherib makes very clear that the king submitted to him in person. Usually, this king was not permitted to live but was executed and replaced. That Sennacherib's victory over Hezekiah was not quite the success Sennacherib is trying to sell it for is also shown by the highly unusual tribute payment. It's too large to be a normal yearly payment, and such large one-time tributes were paid as an expression of surrender or submission. But in such cases, the submitting king always presented himself in person to offer the tribute and show his submission, as in this Assyrian illustration. He would either come out of his city, welcome the Assyrian king into his palace, or be obligated to travel to Nineveh and present himself in person there. It was intended to be a humiliating experience that would make sure the submitting king would not forget his place. Hezekiah's tribute was apparently presented and accepted without Hezekiah's personal appearance, another compromise by the Assyrian king. None of this proves the biblical account of divine deliverance, but it certainly does not conflict with it and provides indirect confirmation. This does, of course, not yet explain the tribute or clarify when and where it was presented, that second question. So let's look at how the Book of Kings speaks about the tribute. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. At that time Hezekiah stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorposts that Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. It is often assumed that Hezekiah paid this tribute to persuade Sennacherib to discontinue his attack. But in that case, Hezekiah paid entirely in vain. Perhaps that's not the most likely explanation. How else can we explain or reconcile the accounts of kings and Sennacherib? One option is that there were two tribute payments. That would remove the conflict, but it is unlikely. Hezekiah was already stretched to pay once. How could he have paid such a hefty sum again after the invasion had devastated his kingdom and its economy? It may be that Sennacherib misrepresents the time and the place of the payment. It's hard to see, though, why he would do this. Different from his spin on what he managed to do to Hezekiah, it does not place him in a better light. It could be that Sennacherib is correct on this point, the third option. We should notice what the biblical text does not say. Negotiations began in Lachish, but we are not told when and where the tribute was actually paid. The only time reference in verse 14 through 16 is at that time. Now, this is vague and imprecise. Notice that verse 13, the first sentence in the statement, is a general statement and summarizes the entire campaign in Judah. Around that time, when Sennacherib attacked and conquered the cities of Judah, Hezekiah paid a tribute. Notice the parallel use of this phrase at that time in another verse a little later in 2 Kings. At that time, Merodach-Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent envoys with letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that Hezekiah had been sick. This is also vague and rather broad. Was this before or after the attack? It can hardly have been during the invasion. It is usually assumed that it preceded the attack because Merodach-Baladan was pushed out of Babylon in 703 BC. At that time is therefore a phrase with some flexibility built in. We should also notice 2 Kings 19 verse 37. Sennacherib was killed by two of his sons. In the biblical text, it sounds like this took place shortly after the campaign. But it actually happened in 681, about 20 years later. Clearly, the account in Kings is not interested in detailed chronology. Taken together, this leaves open the possibility that the tribute payment, while perhaps initiated at the start of the attack, was finalized afterwards. Interestingly, although the account in Isaiah 36 and 37 is almost word for word identical to the one in Kings, 2 Kings 18 verse 14 through 16, the verses about the tribute, are missing in Isaiah. Did Isaiah delete these verses? Did Kings insert them? It's hard to know, but in the latter case, the tribute episode may have been added from another source and not be in its chronological place. All of this leaves us with two questions. Why does Kings place the tribute verses at the beginning? And why does Hezekiah still pay after Sennacherib left? To the first question, well, perhaps these verses illuminate the reason for the invasion. In the passage right before it, we read of another Assyrian invasion by King Shalmaneser, who invaded the kingdom of Israel, besieged Samaria and took its people into captivity, because they had disobeyed God. This is not the reason given for the invasion by Sennacherib. Sennacherib comes not because Hezekiah has rebelled against God, he has not, but because he rebelled against the Assyrian king. Why would Hezekiah still pay after Sennacherib left? Matti argues that the Assyrian army was not destroyed in its entirety. Since it had been campaigning in more than one location at the same time, one or more camps may have survived, at least in part, and continuing Assyrian presence in Judah or nearby would pose a threat. There was a chance that Sennacherib would return to finish what he had started. To present this, the tribute was paid, so Matti, and as it turned out, it effectively ended the threat. We now come to the question why Sennacherib returned to Nineveh. You may think the answer is obvious, because his army was destroyed, but again, the text does not explicitly state this. Quote, "And that night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. When people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went home and lived at Nineveh." Now, event B, Sennacherib's departure, followed event A, the destruction of the Assyrian army. That does not necessarily mean that B is caused by A. It might be, but this is not certain. Other explanations have been offered. There are basically four options. 1. The tribute persuaded Sennacherib to call it a day. Not likely, as nothing in the text points this way. 2. According to Isaiah's prophecy, Sennacherib would leave because of a rumor he would hear. Quote, "Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land." More on this option in a moment. And then 3, the king of Egypt, or strictly speaking, the king of Cush, came up for an attack. There are those who argue that this is what caused Sennacherib to leave. And then 4, of course, is the destruction of the army. This probably played a role, but in Isaiah's prophecy, it's the rumor, not the destruction of the army, that will make Sennacherib leave. Matti concludes that it was indeed the rumor that was the real reason for Sennacherib's return. Many interpreters argue that this rumor is the report on the Egyptian approach, but Matti argues against this. Again, the text does not state this, and an Egyptian attempt to meddle with the campaign would hardly have been a surprise, and would not have been too worrisome, considering the weakness of the Egyptian involvement so far. In the words of the Rabshakeh, the Assyrian commander, Egypt was a broken reed of a staff, which pierces the hand of any man who leans on it. But above all, an Egyptian attack would be a very bad reason and a bad moment for Sennacherib to leave. One can accuse Sennacherib of many things, but he was not a coward. If any rumor could have moved Sennacherib to leave so Mati, it would be one about renewed troubles in Babylon, a place close to home and of greater importance to Assyria than either Jerusalem or Egypt. This would indeed justify going home. Throughout his life, Babylon proved particularly cumbersome to Sennacherib. His first campaign, as we've seen in 703 BC, dealt with Babylon, and he had to come back twice. In 700, interestingly, the year right after the campaign in Judah, and in 689. At the end of this third campaign against Babylon, he completely erased the city to the ground. But it was to no avail. 75 years later, Babylon would rise to overthrow Assyria forever.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience.